Hello, everyone, and welcome to Flickering Myth TV. My name is EJ Marino, and Alan Christian is joining me for another conversation. This one is going to be fun, because this is our wheelhouse.
Yeah, absolutely. Mine especially. Like, if I've earned anything, it's being able to talk about comic book movies in the 90s.
Yes, that is our big conversation for the day. We are jumping into 90s comic book movies. For me, sometimes a forgotten era. I think we know the 70s with some of the starts of them with Superman. It's kind of basically Superman. Then we have
It's pretty
Batman
much
89.
Superman.
And then the 90s, now we look back, I think we go to the 2000s with Fantastic Four, the X-Men series. There's a lot in the 2000s. I mean, the Blade sequels and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
The 90s, though, we have the original Blade film. We have some, the Roger Corman Fantastic Four movie we never will get. And I really want to see that. I need to
Oh,
find.
I've seen it.
Oh,
I've seen it. I reviewed it we did a whole episode on the Four Color Film podcast about it. It's better than that Josh Trank movie.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm not shocked. I'm not shocked. It actually seems like it's fun. All right, so I wanted to kind of shape this around talking about the good and the bad, and I have some middle movies. Like, I'm going to get one of my middle ones out of the way. I have no reference point for Ninja Turtles. I was not a Ninja Turtles kid, but they were a huge part of 90s comic books and 90s comic book movies. Any Ninja Turtle feelings here for you?
It's still a good movie.
Okay,
Like,
yeah.
I can watch that now and it's still enjoyable. It's hilarious that like this evil mastermind's whole thing is like stealing VCRs. Like, he's basically he's a ninja warlord and he's basically just Vin Diesel and Fast and Furious, but whatever. And he's using teenagers to do it. It's still a good time. 2 is a great kids movie and it's no fun to watch as an adult. If you have no nostalgia for it,
I did just rewatch it with I just watched it for the first time with my best friend who was a big fan of it. I found it incredibly hilarious. I think the suits were better than I remember them being. Like, in my head, they were so like bad. And then I was like, oh, these are pretty good. Still less haunting than the CGI movie versions of them in the 2000s. Hate those things. I like the original designs. So yeah, that's one of my middle grounds. And do you have a middle ground movie? Something you don't have a big feeling on, but you're kind of like, I have to mention it at least.
Just within all of the 90s?
Yes.
My middle ground is probably, I don't know.
I guess from what I've heard from you, Batman Returns kind of falls into your middle ground one.
It does. I think it's a fun movie, but I don't care about it. I don't care about it as much as a lot of other people end up caring about it.
That's a nostalgic one for me. I grew up with Catwoman being like such an iconic character for me. I think I compare that movie a lot to me in some ways to how I feel about The Dark Knight, where it's the Batman character takes the back seat to that, and it's a villain movie. Which Batman's one of the few characters who can do that ever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. It's not a bad movie at all. But it's a better Tim Burton movie than it is a Batman movie.
I just said that on Twitter that I think The Dark Knight is a great Christopher Nolan movie, an okay Batman movie. So I definitely see that. So let's go to one of your big good picks for the 90s. What is your 90s, like when you were like 90s superhero movies? I'm so excited to talk about X, Y, or Z, or comic book movies, not just superheroes, because Tank Girl's not a superhero. That's on my list.
All right. Batman Forever is an eternal go-to for me.
Yep.
I love Batman Forever. I will defend Batman Forever to my death. It's a good movie. But probably my go-to, the one that like resonates with me the most past that, and I've just talked about Batman Forever so much. I do it anytime I get the chance.
You do.
So I have to bring up The Rocketeer.
A film I've never seen. I never thought it would be for me. Nothing against Rocketeer fans. It's one of those movies where I kind of felt the same way I felt about The Iron Giant, where I was like, this is nostalgic for an era that I have no knowledge of. So, okay. But how do you feel about Rocketeer? What is the draw to it? Because there's a lot of people who really like this film.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea, the whole thing, the whole comic was originally created by Dave Stevens, I believe his name is, and it's a throwback to like 30s and 40s, like serials and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Art Deco influences and stuff. And the comic's a little more risque, has a little more to it, and the movie is Disney, so it comes with some of those trappings. But I wish I could remember the name of the guy that they got to play Cliff in it, the Rocketeer, because he is like spot on with the guy. Like they could not have cast a better thing. Jennifer Connelly's in it.
Oh, Jennifer Connelly, I love her.
Yeah, she's fantastic in it. Timothy Dalton being a Nazi spy, fantastic. He's like a Hollywood star that ends up being a Nazi spy. And of course, you got Paul Sorvino in it, he was Paulie in Goodfellas, and he's all sorts of things. But he's like a mob boss in it. It's just a great time. It's just an all-around fun film. Like it keeps all of the adventure and sense of wonder that the comic had. It's good.
It's something I definitely hear people are nostalgic talking about, and it has a nostalgic vibe to it. So I'm glad it made your list, because it's something I had no reference point for it. When I was looking through movies about the list, I was just like, I'm hoping Alan brings this up, because I have no frame of reference.
Love it.
Now, one of my ones, you might have a good frame of reference for it, because it is probably the biggest one of this time period. It's Blade. I was a Blade mark growing up, from the soundtrack to Wesley Snipes to, oh God, Frost
Stephen
is the
Dorff.
villain. Yeah, Stephen Dorff's camp villain. Oh my God. He is back, playing it back row. And I don't even think he knows he's in a camp performance. He's one of those guys I was like, oh, you think you're doing something that's different than what you're giving me.
This movie was early 2000s action trash before that happened. It is proto 2000s action trash.
Yeah.
And
I mean, with the Wesley Snipes one-liners and stuff like that, it definitely feels like that.
Yeah, it almost feels like it should have come out in about 2006 and been a comment on 2000s action trash.
Yes, yes.
Like it gets that, and it gets the camp of it more than anything following it did. But it's a good time. Like I liked the first Blade a lot.
Wesley Snipes is so perfect as that role. I'm one of those ones that, like, I'm upset he's not coming back because, you know, whatever. But like Mahershala Ali is going to be great. I'm very excited for that. But he was such a definitive character. We know when we talk about the you know, those characters, the Hugh Jackman as Wolverine and stuff like that, I always go to Wesley Snipes as Blade. From the haircut to the attitude, he really got it. And I mean, Chris Christopherson even gets it too. And he gets it all the time.
Once, Chris Christopherson gets something. Wesley Snipes is one of the most underappreciated actors to ever work, because he has a charisma all of his own. Like, I love Wesley Snipes. You can throw Wesley Snipes in anything, and
you could throw him in drag,
U.S. Marshals,
or you could throw him in drag like Tu Wong Fu, and he is the best part of that film. He is just so good as a drag queen. That's over the top. Like, it's just one of those things. He was really that guy, and I think him playing, and when I was doing some research, he wasn't even the first choice for Blade, which blows my mind that they almost went with somebody, and then he ended up doing really good with martial arts, and then like everyone's like, oh, he's very much like, there's this one actress in the 90s who wanted to play Catwoman, who was like going for the role. He was doing that, but actually
Sean Young.
Yes. Yeah.
That is why Sean Young doesn't work anymore.
Yeah. Sean Young like meowing and shitting in a litter box for a role. Now, I'll do one of my other good ones, because keeping up with a dark goth mystique, which was so my thing, I am a Mask of Phantasm fan. It's the Batman animated movie from the 90s. I don't know how you feel about this, because
wonderful.
Yeah, okay, good, because sometimes it's a little, it's not the greatest, I think, made movie. I think it has the dated vibe that sometimes the Batman animated series vibe has. On a scale, though, it's a good feature. It actually has a good plot, and first time I never knew the villain, so they got me.
it feels a little made for TV because it was, and then they decided to throw it in theaters, which wasn't a bad choice because it's a good movie. I just don't think it did. I mean, I'm sure it did more business than it cost to make, but it's a good one. It really is good. It is a good. It condenses what the animated series is very well, I think.
And that animated series, I mean, I know it's not a movie, but like it was a huge part of my upbringing and my thing. Like I was a Batman animated series fan before I was like a DC fan. I was just like, oh, this is cool and dark, and the Joker. I mean, Mark Hamill's Joker is the Joker. I'm sorry.
Like, yeah, that's like, fair. I mean,
done. He's my
that
favorite.
Series is what kept me a Batman fan after Batman and Robin. So.
I could understand, which I don't want to bring up Batman and Robin because it would be on my bad list.
You don't have a choice.
But, okay, and then give me one more of your goods before we jump into some of the bads.
Okay, another one of my goods is, it's hard to say.
Barbed wire? Yes, mine too.
Barbed wire is, it's written down here with the notation that is under notably bad.
It is very bad.
It's a good time. This is going to maybe throw you for a loop, but The Mask.
Yeah, okay, here's where my loop comes from. I had no idea it was from a comic. So that surprised me. I'm not the biggest Jim Carrey person. But boy, do I like The Mask. One, Cameron Diaz, baby Cameron Diaz is so stunning in that film. Oh my goodness. And that's Jim Carrey being the cartoon character he is. Like, I'm not an Ace Ventura fan because it feels like a cartoon. But when he's playing a cartoon character, it just works for me.
It works.
And he's so good in that film. That is... I'm so sad it has really bad sequels because that one, oh god, that Jamie Kennedy one. But that one is such a good one. I'm glad you put it on your list because I again wouldn't have put it because it's not one of my go-tos. It would have been in my middle ground. But what about The Mask do you like?
It's just, I don't know. It's just it gets what it is. Now the comic it's based off of is much darker and not really a good time. Like, it's a very violent comic book.
Oh, wow.
But this just takes the idea from it and it's like, let's make that kid friendly. And somehow that works way better than the comic book does. Like, I like that it's a big cartoon.
Yeah.
I like that it is Jim Carrey getting to do that without being annoying. Like, everybody wants to talk about like how he like found his voice as an actor in like the 2000s, but him like playing like Stanley Ipkiss and like being this, down on his luck guy that's not at all Jim Carrey, just this depressed dude, and then he puts the mask on and becomes full Jim Carrey, like, phenomenal. And it's just, I mean, it's a pretty standard like superhero action arc thing with, you get the villain and all that. It's all pretty run of the mill. Like, nobody had a huge good idea here, and somehow it still just works.
Which, it's funny you call it run of the mill and kind of typical, but it's one of the first really of its kind. Like, going back to the Supermans and that, they didn't have the comedy element. There wasn't really a comedy, I think without The Mask, we would have like a Thor Ragnarok, or hell, most of the MCU movies kind of comedy base. I really think that was the first of its kind. You could tell me I'm wrong and missing one, but I really think that was the first one that put comedy next to comic book.
In that way, in like full on selling itself as a comedy, maybe. You definitely had things like Return of Swamp Thing, which were intended to be a comedy and were successful as a comedy, in my opinion. But to be like something put on Front Street to be sold to people as a comedy, maybe. I mean, it's certainly the most successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I'm looking at a couple in my bad. Talking about one that I think is intentionally comedic, and not unintentionally comedic. It's Steel. I had to talk about Steel. I watched this movie as a kid because I I don't know, it was the 90s and we all liked Shaq for some reason. Like it was a thing.
Same. Yeah.
And it was DC related and it has a dark vibe to it. And I like that. And then I see it. And what is that movie?
That movie is the hammiest piece of shit ever made. And I love it for it. I like Steel. It is an awful, awful movie. And there's no reason Shaquille O'Neal should have been cast in that. He is not an actor. I mean, I guess Kazam worked and they were just like, throw him in this movie. I'm pretty sure Kazam came first. It's bad. It's very bad, but in this ultimately just very hammy way that kind of makes it a little bit endearing. But I don't recommend anybody go out of their way for it.
No, I wouldn't. I'm like, if it's one of those things, like it's been on like the DC streaming service and all that, if it's there one day and you're bored, watch it. It's funny. But for me, I think it's interesting learning about comic books. You can't do Steel without like the Death of Superman arc. So it's just one of those things that they just took a character. They're like, well, this is a good idea. And I'm like, but he is a product of something else. So I always thought it was so funny that DC it's never learned. Now looking at what DC's doing now, and I'm like, oh, well, you guys are
okay. I mean, you are 100% right about that, but you would be incorrect if you thought that they were just doing that movie independently, because it was very much supposed to be a counterpart to the Tim Burton Tim Burton directed, Kevin Smith written Superman Lives.
Oh,
it was very much supposed to be part and parcel with that.
Wow, what a weird cinematic universe that would have been. We would have had Nick Cage Superman and Shaquille O'Neal Steel.
And we were deprived of that.
With George Clooney Batman, maybe?
Maybe
we could have got Kilmer back. We would have just had Clooney again. That would have been fine. Because Keaton was long gone. Keaton was doing Jack Frost by then.
Yeah.
Now, what is one of your bads?
Okay, the entire year of 1997.
Just cancel the year.
Cancel the year, because that year brought us 3 films.
Okay.
Only ones? 3 superhero films. Steel.
Yep.
Batman and Robin.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst superhero movie ever made, Spawn.
Spawn. Oh, Spawn's in my middle.
How can it be in your middle?
Because I have a Michael Jai White love. He is very much the character.
I am a huge fan of Michael Jai White. Give that man all the work in the world. No, EJ, no.
I don't know. The John Leguizamo clown, just something about it. Again, I liked the dark, spooky horror elements to it. But then I get to the final act when he's fighting in hell, and it looks like a PlayStation. No, it looks like an old PC game. Like, I'm not even giving it PlayStation graphics. So yeah, that's where I check out. But there's just the iconic scene when he's coming into the party with his cape and stuff. There's just moments I genuinely thought was interesting and fun. That's a movie that, I always see posts of like, well, we should be remaking bad movies. Where is the new Spawn? Todd McFarlane, let somebody else do this. Not casting Jamie Foxx, though Jamie Foxx has left the project. So yeah.
He's still trying to put one together. No. There's nothing you could say to me.
Okay, no, I never knew. I never knew you were so Spawn. Against Spawn.
Oh, it's awful. It is awful. There was a point on the 4-Color Film podcast where you would get kicked off and muted if you said the name Spawn. I hate it. I think it is one of the only things we ever awarded 0 stars.
Yeah, I could. Yeah, not even Batman and Robin. Wow, I'm so sorry.
No, Batman and Robin is a better movie. It's a genuinely better film.
Yeah,
and it's certainly more fun. I thought it was miserable. I think it's a miserable movie. Spawn is, but that trifecta killed the genre.
I can't think of a 1998 film, and then 99.
There isn't one.
And then when we're doing 99, it's just Mystery Men.
It's just Mystery Men.
Yeah.
So yeah. Wait, when was Blade?
Blade was 98, so I think that was the 98.
It was just Blade. It was just Blade. That squeaked in.
Which is why but they gave it a super low budget. They marketed it as a straight up horror film. So they were trying to hide the comic book elements to that, I think,
when that movie came out, I did not know it was based off of a comic book.
Yeah.
So, they really just brushed that under the rug.
I think that actually that whole series felt very like we're trying to distance ourselves from the comic books, even after when they did Blade Trinity, which is after the Spider-Man and X-Men come up of the early 2000s. So it is interesting that they really did try to distance themselves, which I'm not happy Marvel Studios owns everything, but I'm excited to see them actually treat Blade as the comic book roots he has.
Yeah, that'll be nice. But yeah, I mean, it's just, we had that and we had Mystery Men. After 1997, after those three movies, people were just like, well, I guess these aren't really the cash cows we thought they were. It's like, no, they are. You're just bad at them.
Yeah, and in the era of the big blockbusters, which the 90s is, as much as the 80s is, the 90s is the Roland Emmerich era, the Men in Black era, which I'm going to ask you your feelings on Men in Black in a second. Okay. I'm just so curious of why these weren't the big money cash cows. And I can see the 1990 Captain America film not winning anyone over because it's like half Italian. That's a strange-ass film that I've watched on YouTube once. I recommend everyone try. I recommend everyone try it because it's banana cuckoo pants. But
it's J.D. Salinger's son as as Captain America in that. Fun facts. That one's an awful one. What did you just ask me?
Is Punisher from 89 or 90?
89. I consider that all kind of part and parcel because Batman really kicked all that off. Yeah. I like the Dolph Lundgren Punisher. It is like the first two acts are very mediocre, but the third act, like the climax of that movie, is incredibly well done. It's very cinematic. That's God, I wish I could remember the name of the director, but he went on to do some much better things. But I think that's a good movie.
Good.
Yeah. Marvel put out 3. They made 4
yes.
in the 90s. Or, if we're including 89 with Punisher. Of course, they did that Captain America movie, which is a snoozer. It's bad. It's not good.
It's so not a comic book movie where you would think of it. Now it's like a TV drama in so many ways.
Yeah, it is a strange piece. Of course, they did the Roger Corman produced Fantastic Four movie.
Which, if anyone doesn't know who Roger Corman is, he is a schlock B producer director from the 70s, 80s. I mean, still, like he was doing stuff for a long time. I don't know if he's passed, but Corman was like there, and like
he's still alive. He
liked cheese.
Yeah. And a lot of really good filmmakers came from his camp. Like Scorsese's first movie, I think, was under
James Cameron is Piranha 2 or Piranha 3, one of those, one of the two Piranhas. Like, so that's a Corman thing. And I mean, James Cameron has never done a horror film after, so Terminator has elements. But yeah, so it's just interesting to hear these 90s because I don't know if Marvel fans know the dominance that they have now was not there. I mean, Howard the Duck in the 80s murdered Marvel movies. Like, and I mean, I have a soft spot for Howard the Duck for being a camp, crazy, one of the worst movies ever, but I like it. But it's crazy to think, and I really wanted to do this shout out for Marvel fans to know you guys are lucky now. If you were a Marvel fan in the 90s, but with the bankruptcy of the comics, having to sell off rights to everything and all that, it was not a good time where DC, as much as Steel was a bad film, they were still putting them out. I mean, those Batman movies had marketing out the butt. Like those, until Batman Returns scared McDonald's and Burger King. They said no more of that. But yeah, it's just interesting. The way we have flipped in the 90s was truly a DC time. I mean, Blade was really what saved Marvel. Because without Blade, I don't think we would have gotten to the Bryan Singer era of X-Men,
It's strange if you really look at the comic book movies in the 90s. It's not. It's certainly not Marvel.
Yeah.
Blade is really the only success, the only really notable thing they did in the 90s. Even if you're counting The Punisher, that came straight to video here.
Yeah.
And while you have Well, you have the Batman movies.
I mean, Superman was still on
Steel.
hiatus.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because
it's really just the Batman movies and Steel.
Yeah, I was, because I always thought there was a Superman. I mean, I guess you go to the TV front, and both are doing pretty well with TV, though, with the animated series that they have and stuff like that, which, I mean, both brands were really saved by their cartoon era. I mean, with Spider-Man and X-Men, and then the Batman and Superman. I always forget Superman has that animated series that some people actually
that's
like.
a good one. That is a good one.
I've never seen it.
Some of the best Superman stuff.
Good to know, because I'm not a Superman fan, so maybe I should have watched that as a child.
Oh yeah, I mean it's the same people that did the Batman series.
That Bruce Timm era, right?
Yeah, Bruce Timm, Paul Dini, their whole creative thing there. It's good. But yeah, the people that had the most, maybe not the most success, but I mean a lot of it. Some of the most produced stuff just came from the smaller imprints.
It's all, yeah. I mean, Spawn, even Barbed Wire. Not that Barbed Wire was a big thing, but you got a huge name, Pamela Anderson.
Horse.
Yeah, so those
Wire,
were those.
The Mask is Dark Horse.
I mean, that's even when
been put up by Image.
That's even when Hellboy was starting to get developed earlier, when Guillermo del Toro was looking at it and stuff too. So like, that's a lot of stuff was happening then. Not that didn't get cooked up until the 2000s, but those ideas were still there, because then he ended up doing Blade 2, which is like early 2000s, like 2002 maybe. Which. Man, Blade. That's a series that I really wish people would go back. Maybe not Blade Trinity, because Wesley Snipes hated working on that movie. Goyer.
Yeah, understandably. Would you have to work with both Ryan Reynolds and Triple H? Would you have a good time?
Oh no, yeah. I mean, Parker Posey's in it, and she's always a gem. So
yeah, that's fine.
It's just interesting to see. We look at the Marvel DC fight that we have now with movies, and it's just so crazy that at one point neither one were the powerhouse that they are now.
Yeah, I said the smaller comic book publishers were having a much more of a heyday.
I mean, even Tank Girl, we haven't spoke about it. That's one of my favorites. I remember it being like,
a good time.
What the hell is this? I mean, they have Ice-T in a starring role before Law and Order. Like, come on.
Tank Girl's great. A lot of people don't like it, but that Sylvester Stallone Judge Dredd, I think, is a good time.
I like Judge Dredd. I do think the 2012 version is a much better film.
It is.
with Carl Urban getting the character as well.
Arguments for me.
I definitely think that Judge Dredd film has qualities to it, because again, there was those elements that they weren't these mass produced. We have to make $1 billion, so they were just like, go out and be ridiculous. As much as Spawns and all that were ridiculous.
Just did weird things. They made The Shadow with Alec Baldwin, which is not good. Don't watch that.
Yeah. Even Phantom with Billy Zane.
The Phantom was the next thing I was bringing up, because I am a Billy Zane stan here.
I mean, come on. We're from the 90s. Like, we have to. Demon Knight. Come on, Titanic.
Demon Knight's so good. I love Demon Knight.
Me too. Like, we have a whole Billy Zane episode.
Oh, I'm 100% on board with that.
Now, is there any other ones before we start wrapping up that you want to mention? Anything on your list that you're like, bad or good, that you have to talk about?
Bad or good? We should mention. We said that there were only a couple of Marvel movies, but we did not mention technically the biggest success Marvel Comics had in the 90s.
Which is?
Men in Black.
Men in Black, which, that's something
I knew.
Malibu
Comics. That first movie has Marvel Comics on it.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
Wow.
It says Marvel Comics in the thing there.
And that was a massive film, which also still felt like a comic book. There was the cartoony vibe, the over-the-top vibe. It was dark as well. I mean, that movie, that cockroach guy.
Yeah. Vincent D'Onofrio
is just, oh
terrifying.
My goodness. Like,
terrifying.
When he pulls his face, what a great film. That first, if anyone hasn't seen that first Men in Black movie in a while, go revisit it. It's aged well.
So worth your time. The second one hasn't. The third one's pretty decent, but the first one is so good. And like, Will Smith is on his A game there, and him playing off Tommy Lee Jones in that is just phenomenal.
Yeah,
like
the whole cast is great.
There's that one bit which I didn't catch it until like I've seen this movie dozens of times, but I didn't catch it until we watched it whenever we did it on the podcast. There's just this great bit where Will Smith asked Tommy Lee Jones something. It's like, "Hey, when do I get to use that little flashy thingy or whatever?" And then Tommy Lee Jones was like, "When you're an adult or when you grow up." And Will Smith just like very casually goes, "Oh, okay."
That was chemistry. That's that comic book chemistry that, again, we like from the Marvel movies now, that banter, that witty back and forth, that genuine connection between a universe. You cared about those two by the end of the movie. And that was hard to do in the 90s. I loved me all these Batman that were crazy over the top. I loved me these, like, Blades and all that. I didn't care. Bye, Whistler, bye. Kill him off the sequel. Like, I'm good. But like those characters you actually cared about. And I think that was so interesting that Marvel really did have such a success with that and Blade. Those are two late 90s films I really think is what gave people faith for the X-Men Spider-Man that we ended up getting, which we go back to those movies, they feel very early 2000s. They're not as flawless as we remember those first two X-Men. There's
that first X-Men movie is not good. It's not bad, but like,
and I feel that way with Spider-Man as well too. It's rough around the edges.
It is rough around the edges. That first Spider-Man movie is it's good. I still think it's good, but it's certainly aged.
Raimi was scared to be Raimi until we get to 2, and he goes full Raimi and scares kids.
Yeah.
So this has been a really fun conversation to go back to a time period. We've been doing the 90s on the podcast, so I got inspired to let's keep going up, and this is something we both are. This is the era that shaped us to where we are now, I think. So as much as we were there for some of the 80s stuff in the 70s, we can cultural osmosis it, but this was our time period. Now we might have to do 2000s, like that 2000 to 2009, because those we have Ghost Riders, we have everything. This is when everyone just started doing everything.
I can do every bit of that.
So
this is my wheelhouse. I hate that it is like digging this far in like made me kind of have a little bit of hatred for these movies, but overall, there's still the gems there.
Oh, absolutely. And they make you, like I said, that's one of my things this year, as I want us to appreciate what we have now. As much as I'm tired of the MCU and DC having no direction, we could always go back to the 90s, and I don't want that. Like, do I want less superhero movies? Sure, but I like where we are now with them being taken seriously by studios and at least having fun. Not as many risks. 90s were risky. We almost had a Nick Cage as Superman with a mullet, so almost there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Nobody pull that trigger now. Yeah, absolutely.
I want that. If anyone hasn't done a documentary, check that out. But yes, thank you so much for joining me for this. This was fun. We might have another episode with 2000s. There's some stuff I want to talk about in there.
Absolutely. Real quick, we should probably shout out that we do the podcast. we never talk about that on here. And check us out on the Flickering Myth podcast every week-ish.
Yes, you do a fantastic job hosting it. We have so many fun topics this week. We talked about Palm Springs, Hamilton, the 90s. Alan got me to watch Palm Springs, a little mini Palm Springs review. I had a good time with it. Sandberg was fun.
Yeah, I loved it. And a little bit of self-promotion, even though it's mothballed right now. If you want to hear me talk about every superhero movie ever made, I did for a long time have a podcast called the Four Color Film Podcast, and I went into all of these.
Oh, detailed as well. I was on the Man of Steel one. I learned my lesson about that. Learned my lesson to not piss off Alan with Zack Snyder. All right, I will link all of that down below so you guys can check out our podcast. You can check out the Four Color Film Podcast. I cannot wait for you guys to check those out. There are some fun details. Thank you again for joining me so much.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Make sure you guys comment down below. Subscribe to Flickering Myth because we make videos like this every single week. Give me a thumbs up because YouTube takes those way too seriously. All right, guys, let's talk about 90s superhero movies down below.